This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design and development from a group of people with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 332, Permission Management. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Today we're talking about permission management with Benji Fisher. Benji started out as a mathematician, and his first OSS contributions were for the Vim text editor in the 2000s. He has been contributing to Drupal since 2011, and these days Benji is one of the maintainers of the Migrate API in Drupal core, and he helps moderate the weekly Drupal usability meetings. Benji, welcome to the show, and thank you for joining us.
Hi, thanks, Nick.
Also joining us for the second week now is Abby, who's the current web chief at the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, also known as ATF. And she's a Drupal GovCon co-organizer and virtual logistics lead. Welcome to the show.
Great to be here again.
I'm Nick Laughlin, and today my co-hosts are, as usual, John Picozzi. What's new with you this week?
So, as the listeners may know, I'm a little slow to adopt things. So I have started watching this Netflix show called The Squid Games. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail about the Squid Games because it's let's say rated R type content, right? But it is so fascinating that basically, the premise is that people that are down on their luck are invited to play this game where the end result, if you don't win, is death. So, or I should say dying. So like it's interesting from a bunch of different factors. One is the fact that like people, they go to this game, then they find out what the end result is. They're allowed to like kind of leave, but then they go back to playing the game. And then the other part is the relationships that bond as they're playing this game together, and how people are, what drives people, and so on and so forth. So if you haven't checked it out yet, if you're like me and you're living under a rock, or you just haven't had time, I recommend getting into it because my wife won't watch it, so I have to find time to watch it like by myself. But like it's kind of interesting, kind of addicting, and it's Korean, I believe. So Netflix does voiceover. And the voiceover is actually pretty good, where like you don't mind that it's voiceovered, or at least I don't. I know some people that would just read the subtitles. You could go either way. But anyway, the other thing you may notice is I'm wearing a cool hat. This hat is furnished by the fine folks at MidCamp. Unfortunately, they are not having a camp this year. But Avi did say that if I gave a shout out, I could tell our listeners to email info@midcamp.org with your name and mailing address, and he would mail out one of these nifty MidCamp hats. So there you go, listeners. Free giveaway here on Talking Drupal of a MidCamp hat. They are quite soft and keep your head very warm.
Yeah, and for our audio listeners, it's a beanie, so it's not like a baseball cap. It's a beanie with the MidCamp logo.
That is a good point. It is a departure from my normal baseball type style hat.
I think so MidCamp was the first camp I couldn't go to because of COVID, and it's really a bummer because it's really a great camp, and I'm sorry that they canceled it this year. They at least had an online version last year.
I would also like to add to that. I've never been to MidCamp. I hear it is great. And if you are in the Chicago area, or you're interested in supporting a camp on the leadership team, apparently they are looking for new leadership team members. So feel free to include in your free hat email, hey, I'm also interested in joining the leadership team.
Also joining us is Abby. What's new with you this week?
Yeah, I will, just to pair it off the Squid Games. I also love the show. The movie Parasite is also by a famous Korean director, addresses the whole capitalism metaphor thing very, very well, with a lot of blood as well. So highly recommend that. This week, our big excitement was checking out a new Turkish market nearby. And it's actually like a decent mid-sized grocery store, which is pretty amazing. Usually they're like little hole in the wall, like 3 shelf type places. And this is huge and had tons of stuff. And so we made Turkish lentil soup. And I'm not a cook at all, but my 2022 resolution is to try to force myself to learn how to make some basic stuff. So that was a big hurdle for me to overcome. And my other point, I'm just going to continue my game of the week theme by recommending just a couple good board games, because I love video games and board games that are really easy to play socially distanced. So invite friends over outside or on a fire pit. This is something that folks can stay socially distanced and still play together. My fave is Metro X. This is basically you're drawing cards and then creating your own little, with a whiteboard, metro map. So everyone's creating a different metro map, trying to be the most efficient metro planner that you can be. Similar vein, they're all kind of transportation related. Railroad Inc., you're doing kind of a similar thing with railroad planning. And then there's a final one for anyone who likes kind of fantasy adventure D&D. There's one called Cartographers, which I love playing, don't own, but you're basically creating little Tetris grid maps of a fantasy realm. And it also involves passing your paper to someone else so they can draw monster shapes and mess up your map and cause you to lose points. So it's got some interaction, but still very playable, socially distanced.
Okay. I have 2 questions. One, because I think Stephen raised it last week when he was looking at our screenshot. Behind you there, is that a bookshelf or holding case for board games?
All board games. And I've got more little ones stuffed in drawers under the TV.
Okay. So there's clearly an addiction there. That's good.
It's kind of a bad addiction during the pandemic because you really haven't touched most of these for the last 2 years, but hopefully we're getting back to a place we can play them again.
It's healthy. And going to the 2022 resolution, you thought Turkish lentil soup was like a good foyer into starting to cook more, like a peanut butter and jelly sandwich wasn't like, hey, let's start small.
I can manage those. No, so my husband's Turkish. I spent years in Turkey during grad school and everything. So for me, like if I'm going to have to make something at home, I'd rather pick something easy and yummy that I can't like get takeout of. So that was my motivation for picking that.
Makes sense.
Also joining us for this week as our guest is Benji. What's new with you this week?
Hi. So on the professional front, my company, Fruition, has decided that they want to be more involved in the Drupal community. So they've already been sponsoring me for 4 hours a week. And that about covers the time for the 2 meetings I attend regularly, the weekly migration meeting and the Drupal usability meeting. And they're going to increase that. Still working out the details, so I can't give you a particular number of hours. But I'll get to spend more time contributing to Drupal. And at the risk of jinxing myself, I'm going to volunteer for the security team. And that doesn't necessarily mean that I'll be accepted on the security team, but I'm going to give it a shot.
Awesome.
Well, that's awesome.
There. Yeah, that's great. It's great to hear when companies are, kind of putting their best foot forward, supporting their employees, giving back directly. And this, like, it's something that we talked about at GovCon, the difference between contributing back code in a patch for like a client versus allowing your employees to give back in kind of the way that you've been doing it, supporting the Migrate API, or as we'll talk about today, the permissions page. It's really valuable for them as well as the rest of the project. But not every company sees that value. So that's great.
I think I may use that as an example in my DrupalCon presentation.
So for me, I have a really quick tip this week and a suspicion that Benji can maybe confirm or deny. So there's a Drupal 9.3 came out about a month and a half ago. And anybody who's updated Drupal 9.3 has probably noticed this. And it wasn't widely publicized, but I ran into an issue with it for a couple of clients, and that is there are a significant number of changes in config going from a previous version to 9.3 or later. And by significant, I mean several projects, the config changes are somewhere around 1,000 files and 20 or 30,000 line changes. And the reason for that is the config that's stored on the file system, the config in the database didn't necessarily have to match. Like there was no set order. And my understanding is that now by default, it will match the config schema laid out in the module, which means that, the reason why there's all these updates is it's now just syncing those up. And so it's a significant number of changes to config, but nothing's actually changing. I bring it up just to mention it has caused a couple problems for a couple clients. One, myself, when I first did it, I thought I made a mistake because, I was just updating from 9.2.9 or whatever to 9.3, and there were 700 files changed. But I had another client that ran an update and didn't commit those changes, thinking that they had also made a mistake. And it turns out that puts your site in a state of permanent changes, because when the database imports the config, the database goes, oh, we need to order this by the schema, orders them by the schema, then looks at the files and goes, oh, these files are different than what I have in the database. So there are changes, but you can't import them. Well, you can import them, but it's not going to mark them as similar because the file is different than the database. And so, especially if you've committed stuff in between, like if you didn't notice this right away, you can get in a state where it's a little complicated to fix. So just a shout out, if you're updating from anything prior to 9.3 to after 9.3, make sure everything is clean before you do that, because you're going to have more changes than you can review. And so you want to make sure that you're only exporting those changes.
Yeah, I can say a few things about that. So, so it specifically applies to keyed arrays in the YAML files. And I think the YAML spec is very explicit that when you have a keyed array, the order is not defined. And so in the past, every so often when you save some form, change some config, you find that some line is moved around in your config file, and it happens 1 or 2 lines at a time, but it happens frequently. And I'm pretty sure that the goal of this change in 9.3 is that we'll have one huge change when we upgrade to 9.3. And from now on, the order will be determined. So you won't have any more of these little nuisance changes every time you update configuration. It's definitely mentioned in the release notes. So
yes. It was not publicized beyond that, though, that I've seen. And I wish it had been.
And the last thing I can say about that is that I saw a tweet suggesting that if you're reviewing changes on the command line with the git diff, there are some extra parameters you can pass, the color and changed or something like that, or moved, that will, I guess it will apply different colors to the lines that have moved without changing. And
yeah,
and when you are reviewing.
Yeah, when there's 30,000 changes, though, you still can't get through that list.
Well, you hit spacebar, and look for anything that's the wrong color. And then you have to pay attention to that.
Yeah, that's definitely helpful. And just one question for you, Benji. I'm curious if this is tied to the topic today at all. Like, was part of the impetus that the permission changes in config were just introducing too many of those occasional changes, or is it just like a completely separate initiative that just happened to land at the same time?
Don't pin this on Benji.
No, not my intent.
There are, in fact, lots of great things added in Drupal 9.3. The other one that comes to mind is bundle classes, which I'm just sort of itching for a chance to get to use them on a client project, but I haven't yet.
So we'll try to have some links in the show notes to some of these changes, because I don't think we have a lot of great stuff to get to today, and I don't want to go down too many rabbit holes. So we do have a module of the week this week. The module is flood control. So people who have been in the Drupal community for a long time are probably familiar with flood control, the purpose behind flood control. If you try logging in to a Drupal site more than 5 times with the wrong password, you will get blocked.
For an hour.
It depends on how many times you've done it. You'll get blocked in a table. You're not blocked as a user. You get added to a flood table, and as long as you're in that flood table, you cannot log in. And there's no interface for bringing people off of that table or cleaning it. And so there used to be a module called Flood Unblock, which has now been deprecated in favor of flood control. And it really just gives you the ability to say, hey, this user is a real user. They just don't know how to type in a password. Let them try again.
I mean, they may not be using a password manager. Back in the day, before password managers were prevalent, there are definitely instances where I would goof my password 5 times and then have to go actually into the database, into the flood table, and like rejigger things so that way I could log in. This module is awesome because it prevents you from having to tamper with your database.
Yep. And so, that's all it is. It's just a UI for unblocking users that have managed to get themselves into the table. I think it also gives you an interface for seeing who is in that table. So it helps you debug a bit. So
doesn't it also have
issues?
Doesn't it also have settings to be able to set the flood control to a higher threshold as well? So like if you wanted to say like, we can go up to 10, like we could do that.
I believe so, but I don't know if that's this one or the flood unblock, because I only recently started using flood control. I think when I started updating to Drupal 9.
I think it's this one because yes, it is this one because I have only ever used this one. So I didn't even know flood unblock exists. So just looking at the screenshot on the module page here, you can, change your IP limit to a higher. You can change the window as well. So if you wanted it to be blocked for more than an hour, and then looks like you can also do something similar on contact forms as well, which is interesting. I will say that the IP part of this is interesting too, because if you have folks logging in from the same IP address, sometimes this can become very crucial because people, a bunch of people from the same IP mess up their login at the same time. You can kind of get false positives. So it's another aspect where this module can help you kind of jigger those settings a little bit.
Absolutely. And it's definitely available for Drupal 8.9, and it's got a pretty wide install base of about 28,000 current sites using it. So if this is an issue that you run into, it's definitely worth having. It's one of those utility modules I only install when I need it, but it's great because when you do need it, it's very easy to use. So Florida Drupal Camp is coming up. If you have any questions about that, we've got a quick intro from the team at Florida.
Hi, this is Mike Herschel with Florida Drupal Camp, and holy cow, the Florida Drupal Camp site just launched. With me, I have Adam. Hey, Adam.
Hello.
Adam Varn and Amy June Highline, the Aaron Winborn Award winner. How's it going?
Thank you, Mike.
Adam, what are the dates for Florida Drupal Camp?
It is February 18th through the 20th, 2022 in beautiful Orlando, Florida.
Ooh, do you know what the average temperature is in Orlando that time of year?
I believe it's about 75 degrees Fahrenheit.
You are correct. Amy June, can you give us an overview of how many days this conference is?
It is a 3-day conference. Friday is trainings, half and full day. Saturday is a full day of sessions, and Sunday is sessions and contributions.
We have a brand new website, rockin' Drupal 9, brand new theme. It's at fldrupal.camp. And everyone who's listening is invited to this. And hey, Adam, are we going to have an alligator at the camp, like for real?
We are. We're going to have an actual alligator that you can pet and see and get your picture taken with, and he probably will not bite you. Probably.
Yeah, that's a maybe. But we're seriously going to have an alligator at the camp. And so check out the camp. Session submissions are open. Sponsorships are open. We have 2 of our 3 featured speakers announced. And yeah, so fldrupal.camp, February 18th through 20th, 2022 in beautiful Orlando, Florida. And we're in person. Holy cow. I know, right? All right. Thanks, everybody.
And thank you guys for that. And if we're looking forward to see what comes out of Florida. Okay, so let's move on to our primary topic. So this week we are talking about permissions. So permissions have come a long way in Drupal. There's been, I remember back in the day when that page just wouldn't load sometimes when you had a sufficiently complex site. And in the old days, you had to always use, what was it, fast permissions access, FPA, I think, which was a way to filter and sort that page. But Benji, can you give us kind of a high level overview? What's behind permissions? What are permissions?
Right. So starting from scratch, this is one of Drupal's strengths, right? That it has this really granular permission system. It doesn't have to be hierarchical. You can assign some permissions to one set of users and different permissions to another set of users, and neither one is strictly bigger than the other. So there are dozens or hundreds of permissions on a typical Drupal site. They are organized into roles. Basically, a role is a bundle of permissions, and then you can assign a role to a user. So some typical familiar permissions are to view the admin theme. There are permissions related to the article content type, to edit or delete, and either your own articles or all articles. I don't know, what are your favorite permissions?
I mean, I think it's one of those things that once you get outside the Drupal ecosystem, it really shows you how much we take for granted when it comes to permissions. So maybe 2 years ago, I was working on a project that was in Silverstripe. And Silverstripe, certainly, it's built on the Symfony framework too, so it has a lot of similar underpinnings as Drupal. But we had a content type, and we had to restrict some permissions for a couple of different roles. And there just isn't like a UI for that. You just have to build those roles and permissions in code. And so anytime you need to tweak them or see what the permissions are, you have to look at what permissions and roles you're granting for particular people. And everything is broken out. All the CRUD operations are broken out into individual methods and things. And so, something that in Drupal, like granting a new type of role, read or write access to a particular content type is, aside from deploying it, is like a 10-minute process or 5 or 10-minute process usually. Whereas in this other one, it took a couple of hours of reading document. Of course, I wasn't familiar with the methods and stuff, but it was a couple of hours and a couple of head scratchers to figure out how to grant permissions on a particular content type. And when you get to things like internal entities, like things like paragraphs or nested permissions, again, Drupal just handles that almost out of the box, and other platforms sometimes don't. So I think that's it's a huge value add that Drupal has that sometimes flies under the radar.
I don't think I ever, up until Benji asked that question, I don't think I ever have thought about what my favorite permission is, or like whatever my favorite permission to configure is. But it sent me down a little bit of a rabbit hole. And I feel like I always, almost on every site, there's one module that I install and grant permissions with, which is view unpublished. Like, I feel like that obviously should be in core. And if I know anybody like that does permissions in core, that might be able to push that ahead. But I feel like that's one of those ones that I always install because it's always, the permission system always, like, people always need to view unpublished content, right? So
are we sure that's not in core? Because we just set up our roles.
Okay. No, I mean, I looked at the module page before I made that comment just to ensure that it wasn't in core, and it doesn't say that it is. So,
well, view unpublished content is in core. But it's a single checkbox, not per content type. So
right.
if you need to grant people to, for example, to see only their own unpublished content, or unpublished content for only certain content types, you need to have that.
And I think that's how the core permission works with viewed unpublished. You can view your own unpublished, but you can't view other people's unpublished, which is what view unpublished kind of bridges that gap.
Yeah. So if somebody has permission, for example, to edit, create, delete an article content type, and they have view unpublished, they can't see content that somebody else created until
which is like a major which is like a major problem, right? Because especially if you do like a migration, like the migration owner owns all of that content and nobody else can see it if it's not
depends how you set up the migration. But yeah, that's kind of the opposite of Benji's question. Benji's question was, what's your favorite permission, not what's your favorite missing permission.
Right.
Well, no, I mean, I don't know. I guess that one is kind of my favorite because it gives that granularity to be able to say like, okay, like this role needs access to view this unpublished thing, as where like other roles may not need access to view unpublished things, you know?
I think I have I'll say I have two favorite too. And that is, one is the view admin theme that you mentioned, Benji, because I always forget to set that until I push it up and the client's like, why does this look weird? I'm like, oh, they're not using the admin theme. Oops. And it's because I only have to set that once early in the project, and I would just forget to do that before. And then the other one is view published content, because I kind of had the opposite revelation. Again, it's one of those things where it's just always granted to anonymous users. And I spent a good 5 or 10 minutes, maybe 2 or 3 days ago, last Friday, I built a content API Drupal site for a client. So all their stuff is in React, and I'm building a Drupal site just to host their blog content. And so I didn't want Google to index it or anybody that's not authenticated to see it. And initially I was just using HTTP basic authentication because it's super easy. But I realized that breaks caching. And it also caused problems for loading assets like images, because they were also behind the HTTP basic auth. And so I was like, oh, well, I need to take off HTTP basic auth, but I still don't want anonymous people to see it. I'm like, how do you do that? But I was like, wait a minute, there's just a permission for that for anonymous users. Which obviously, once I disabled that, like I spent like 5 minutes sitting there thinking like, okay, I need to write a controller that I'm like, wait a minute, that's just a basic permission that you literally almost never touch. And so, obviously disabling that worked. But I think having that granular thing is just, it's just a huge value add that the Drupal community 100% takes for granted, because it's been around forever. I mean, ever since I've started working with Drupal, since Drupal 5, most of those base permissions have been available.
I'll say too, for us, I love having the ability to basically have a training wheels role. So that can either be temporary or permanent if you have some people on your staff who are just really not comfortable with Drupal, but need to be able to do certain things. But at previous agencies, right, we used it as training wheels. So you got your most basic role where you could only kind of create your own stuff. Maybe you couldn't publish it. You could just create drafts. You couldn't delete anything, right? Until that user's comfortable in Drupal. And then you can kind of promote them up as their levels of comfort with Drupal increase. And so then when you have content admins who are kind of proto site builders, you can even give them kind of an advanced content editor role. So we've kind of used that to, on the same team, kind of divide up roles by skill and comfort level, so that folks who are less comfortable aren't seeing options that they don't understand how to use and might mess up. And so that's always been super useful.
Please tell me that you actually call that role training wheels, because that
we do internally, but I think we call it something like,
really?
content author. We call it something like nice. So
you've
it's not
graduated
clear.
out of the training wheels role.
Right.
Congratulations. So, Abby, I think that illustrates, right, how amazing the permission system is in Drupal and how granular it can be based on how what the use case is, right? But I'm going to quote Uncle Ben here. With great power comes great responsibility, right? Right, Benji. So the next question here is, what do you think are the biggest problems facing permissions management in Drupal?
So the first is that with so much flexibility, there comes this problem of management. There are like lots and lots of permissions right out of the box. For example, each content type comes with 8 permissions, I think. So there's create, there's add and edit your own, add and edit any, that's 5. There are 3 related to revisions. And then if you have a multilingual site, you've got another one for translation. And then if you've got a bunch of content types, that's 8 or 9 permissions per content type. That's already a lot. Every time you add a new module, well, not every time, but many modules will provide additional permissions. Every filter format that you create, or every text format that you create, like basic HTML or full HTML, comes with the permission to use it or not. So there are just too many permissions. And then there are like requests that we don't have enough permissions, that just as we have permissions related to each content type, a lot of people would like to have permissions for each block type. And one argument against doing that is that, we just have too many permissions already and this will make it worse. And then, as Nick said, it can also be a performance problem, just having so many permissions. And then for every permission and every role, you have the option to assign the permission to the role. So when you're on the admin page for the permissions, it's this huge grid. And if you have too many roles and too many permissions, the page still won't load, although it's less of a problem than it used to be.
It also makes searching difficult too, because I mean, I know there's a filter page, but many times when I'm looking for permission, I'll just do Control F. And if you have something that's common enough, it's going to show up in multiple permissions, but it also shows up in every single checkbox.
That's right.
So if you have like 10 rows, you have to hit enter like 10 times just to get to the next level. So just the management side is complex.
And Fina Proxima, who has a way with words, wrote this on one of the issues I'm talking about today. Anytime any module wants to add per bundle permissions, the already intimidatingly large permissions table swells to an even greater size, like a large poisonous bullfrog. Something must be done. So that, I think, is the biggest problem with permissions. It's something that we've talked about over the years in the usability meetings from time to time. There's another technical problem, or at least there was until Drupal 9.3, which is that permissions are defined by modules, and some of them depend on configuration. For instance, when you create new content type, article, blog post, whatever content types you have, every time you add new content type, which is configuration, you get a bunch of new permissions depending on that content type. Now, when you remove a content type or uninstall a module, it looks from the UI as if those permissions go away. You don't see them anymore. But they are still in your configuration. Any role that had a permission assigned still has that permission assigned even though it's an invalid permission, even though the module or the configuration that it depended on went away. So I know some people who are just bothered by this because it's messy, and they're the ones who actually look at their YAML files when they're updating configuration, and they say, I uninstalled that module. Why is that permission still there? How do I remove it? And the answer is by editing your YAML file. It's doable, but that's not the way it should work. And then there's also the problem that, what if that permission just hangs around forever and you forget about it, and then you reinstall the module or you create the configuration again and forget that you had that permission assigned to that role. Suddenly that permission comes back into force. And we don't want that to happen either. So those are two of the problems that I'm aware of with the current permission system.
Benji, just to clarify the phantom permissions thing, because I'm kind of walking through it in my head and I'm stumbling a little bit. The idea is that you uninstall a module, I don't know, say web forms, right? You uninstall web forms. The permissions are still saved in configuration in your config folder within your site, right?
In the configuration of the roles that have those permissions assigned.
Right. So like module is gone. You then go to, re-import, you export the web form uninstall, right? But the permissions still live in the roles files. You go to import that, and then basically it imports those like that permission is still there. Is that the gist of it?
Yeah, the permission is still there. Well, the permission is still assigned to the role, even though the permission is invalid.
Right. So it doesn't, it's not going to do anything, right? But it's still going to be present.
That's not entirely true. So the reason why I found out about this issue myself was because of the paragraphs permissions module. So we were running into some issues with that module. I don't recall exactly what it was, but we decided to test removing it. And after removing it, we were still, because I think we were loading permissions somewhere. And so we were still having some of that behavior that was causing us to want to remove it. And it took quite a bit of effort to realize that the reason, like somehow them still sticking around was causing that permission to load, which was causing the access to not work the way that we wanted it to. And so this is one of the only times I've actually manually updated config files. I had to actually remove the paragraphs permissions from the roles import after it was uninstalled, and then everything worked the way that we wanted it to. So yeah, I think it's very much an edge case where it's a problem other than just having stuff in your config that is not tidy. But it was kind of weird to me when I found that out, that permissions stick around even when you uninstall modules.
Hey, listen, but then again, tidy config is happy config. Okay.
Well, I mean, the thing is, I immediately was like, well, why is it like that? And then I realized, like, making it, because it's exported configuration, making it a two-way relationship isn't a trivial problem. So I understand why it was done that way in the first case.
Well, so Drupal 9.3 came out on December 9th last year, a few months ago, and it has a bunch of improvements to permission management. So Benji, could you walk us through what those permissions are, or the improvements?
Okay, so one is that each module has its own permissions page. So you now have a page just for the node module. It lists all of the permissions for the node module. You have a page for the filter module, it lists just those. And if you want to see those together, there's a page that does both of them. So that's one. The next one is that phantom permissions are going away. And it's kind of unfortunate that this happened in the same release of Drupal that includes the changes to ordering of things in config files that we were talking about earlier, because you probably won't notice that when you upgrade to 9.3, probably your role configuration files will be updated in two ways. One is that if you had any phantom permissions, they'll be removed.
Nice.
And the second is that some dependency information will be added. Because that's how we get rid of the phantom roles. As of Drupal 9.3, Drupal keeps track of the dependencies of each permission. And those dependencies, again, are always include a module that defines the role and can also include configuration. And a third change in 9.3 is that the standard installed profile now includes a content author role, which is pretty similar to the training wheels role that Abby was talking about earlier. The usual use case for this is like an editing or a magazine scenario where you do have people writing the articles and you don't want to give them permission to publish. So that permission is reserved for someone or for a smaller number of people, for content editors rather than content authors. And spent a long time bike shedding what to call these roles before settling on content author and content editor. But one of those roles has been added. There's still an open issue to add the other one. And it was also a little unfortunate that these two changes came at the same time, because originally the new content author role was going to have some permissions related to content moderation, but content moderation isn't enabled in the standard profile. And now that roles are not allowed to have invalid permissions or phantom permissions, that would count as a phantom permission. And there was actually a little bit of churn as those two issues got committed within a week or two of each other.
Right.
Not always the case that somebody's going to use moderation, right? Like, I think moderation, the use case for moderation is pretty specific in a lot of environments.
Yeah, lots of sites don't. Most of the sites I work on don't enable content moderation.
So I have a question on the first point that you raised, the separate permission pages for each module. That sounds great, but also I'm assuming that the like overarching here are all the permissions module page still exist.
Yes.
Okay.
So how do you get to those separate pages? Is it just from the module install page? Or is there another way to navigate to that?
Yeah, there are a few ways. You could always type in the URL yourself, but if you go to the extend page /admin/modules, where it lists all the modules, there was already a link labeled permissions that would take you to the appropriate section of the overwhelming permissions page. That link now goes to the page just for that module.
Okay.
So that's one way. Second, once we had that page, we had a follow-up issue, and we updated all of the links in the help topics module. Maybe we should talk about that sometime. That's still experimental. And we updated all the links in hook help. So if you're on the help pages, basically, if you're on the help pages and you see a link to permissions, it should now go to the page just for that module.
Oh, cool. And
then the last way you get a link, the standard advice that we always give, or standard instructions for when you're enabling a new module, is you download the module. These days you do it with Composer. You go to the extend page, you enable the module, and then you're told, go and configure permissions for that module. And considering what a disaster the permissions page has been until now, that's terrible. But that has always been the advice. Now, if you're enabling a module through the UI, if you're not doing it using Drush, if you're enabling it through the UI, then the confirmation message has a link to the permissions. And you probably are enabling more than one module at the same time. the link will go to the page that has permissions for just the newly enabled modules.
Oh, that's so useful.
So it's able to spin up kind of a checklist on the fly for whichever multiple modules are requested at a certain time.
Yes,
That's awesome.
I could go into the exact technical details of how it works if you want, but the short answer is yes.
That's awesome. So you don't have to click enable 5 modules, click on 5 different links. You can do one all at once. That's great.
That's right.
Making things easier with Drupal permissions. So let's move not so much away from permissions, but more towards your involvement with this. And I'm just curious, why is this a passion project for you?
Yeah, so there are a couple of ways, a couple of directions that got me involved with all of these issues. So one is the weekly usability meeting. And as I think I said earlier, we've talked about the permissions page before. And for a couple of years, we've been saying, gee, what can we do? What can we do? And finally, I think Verdier had made the suggestion that we have a separate page for each module. He had made that suggestion, and I thought about it, and I realized that it wouldn't be that hard to implement. So I opened an issue to do that and worked on it for a while. So that's how I got into that. And then also we talked about the roles in the standard profile. By default, Drupal, the standard profile, just has the anonymous role for someone who's not logged in, authenticated role for someone who is, and the administrator role, which gets all permissions, and that's it. So adding the content author role is something that we've talked about for a while. And after all the bike shedding and then deciding exactly what permissions it should have, actually implementing it was, of course, the easy part. So, yeah.
For a second there, I'm just curious. You mentioned twice now, I think, the weekly usability meeting. Can you tell us a little bit about that, and then where people could find out more information about that if they're interested in joining?
Sure. That's been going on for a while. For the last year and a half, I've been the moderator of the meeting. If you go to Drupal Slack and the UX channel, that's where we have the related discussion, but the meeting itself happens in Zoom. And 10 minutes before the meeting, we post the link. And so it's a 1-hour meeting. It is every Friday. It is at 10 a.m. Eastern time. It is maybe the only regular Drupal core meeting that is not scheduled in UTC. And so twice a year, we have a little bit of confusion between the Europeans and the Americans about what time the meeting is going to be. And the agenda is set by the people who actually decide to show up at the meeting. We take suggestions in Slack. There's an issue created for each week's meeting, and people can post suggestions there or in Slack. And we try to get to those, but if someone is actually there and wants to talk about something, we'll talk about that.
Very cool. And you said that you've been helping run that for about a year and a half. Were you attending those meetings before that, or
yeah,
how did it started up?
Yeah, I've been attending them for quite a while, and I think in the past, Angie Byron or Webchick has sometimes been running the meetings, and Gabor Kotzi. And I took over actually running the meeting, and this was about the time that I started working for Fruition, and they let me use their Zoom account. So it's nice to have a paid Zoom account for recording the meetings and not having them be time limited.
So with regard to the usability meetings, also, have there ever been any kind of usability studies done on Drupal for new users, particularly, like watching them walk through, having them do some certain tasks and seeing what's difficult for new users?
There have, not enough. And,
Yeah.
We would love to have people do more usability studies. There was one back in 2014 or 15 at the University of Minnesota. We're still working through the backlog of suggestions from that because, of course, core development is really slow. And there are a lot of things where we're sort of blocked by not having usability studies. Like, for example, everyone agrees that the page listing the block types should not be under the content menu. It should be under structure. And I see Abby is laughing because you agree, right? Yeah. Everyone agrees. And it would be so nice to have some user testing to confirm that. And that would really move along that change, because it is a pretty disruptive change. You sort of want to be able to back it up with some evidence that it's actually a better idea.
Right.
Maybe we'll just do it anyway. And maybe I should say, the people who attend the meetings are not usability experts. I'm not a usability expert for sure. What we do have is a variety of backgrounds. We have front and back end developers, we have designers, site builders, content strategists. We have people who speak English as a first language and people who don't, people from different countries. So we do benefit from having a lot of diversity there. But if people want to join the meeting and are not usability experts, they shouldn't let that stop them.
Awesome.
So can you talk a little bit about the process for getting these into 9.3? I think you've had some experience getting things into core because you've worked on the Migrate API, but it also sounds like some of these issues that we're talking about today, you kind of took point on and actually coded some stuff, and others you kind of just, I don't know, I just see there's a couple of permissions issues where I feel like I opened it, there's like 200 comments on them, and about half of them are Benji. And so I'm curious, like what's involved in helping shepherd some of these into core?
And before I answer that, let me point out that it is really easy to see which comments I have made, because I have the most noticeable avatar in all of Drupaldom. I am the yellow pig.
Yep. Yeah, it stands out for sure.
Which I could claim to be sort of a marketing guru based on that, but in fact, it's just dumb luck.
I feel like that's going to be our next soundbite. I am the yellow pig.
Right, one of the beetles, we're not quite sure which is the walrus, but then Benji is the yellow pig. So to answer the question, what does it take to get them into core? I'd like to highlight the role of the reviewer. And it's a really important role and can have a big influence on moving an issue along. So the goal of the reviewer is to help the implementer improve the feature so that it will be easy for the core committer to go ahead and commit it. It is very rare that they're so successful that the committer just comes along and commits the patch. There are always some further tweaks that they want, but you want to at least get it close. And so the issue I talked about before, creating the page for each module, I was the implementer. And I got a lot of good feedback from a few people, in particular Longwave. And based on his feedback, I sort of restructured the way the implementation worked and just made it a little better following the object-oriented paradigm. So instead of introducing some property to the parent class, I was creating a method in the parent class that basically did some refactoring that should have been done anyway. And that turned out to be really lucky because that bit of restructuring, which was not a whole lot of lines of code, but that bit of restructuring that made it much more flexible and enabled the next step, which I think is further down on our agenda. So that was one case where the reviewer was a big help. And then the other issue, the phantom permissions issue, I was the reviewer. Alex Pott was the one doing the implementation. And I looked at it this morning, and my first comment on that issue is from mid-April of last year. And it shows that I made 38 comments, and it was finally committed in early July. So this is a process that took us, 3.5 months, and went through a bunch of reviews. The other thing I looked at is I keep my Git branches around. When I first looked at it, it changed 62 files with 663 insertions and 72 deletions. That is a lot to review. And so I just sort of took a deep breath and decided, okay, I'll start with something easy. I'll review the permissions YAMLs files changes. That should be pretty easy. When I got through that, I took another chunk and I reviewed maybe the non-test changes in the user module. And over the course of a few months, I made it through all of those changes, made some suggestions, and I like to think that I helped improve the patch and made it pretty easy for the core committer to come along and finalize it. It's an unusual situation that the implementer was a core committer, but of course he's not going to commit his own work.
Well, one of the things I'm curious about with that process is, did you find other people were jumping in to review as well, or did they kind of just did they just have like individual comments and small things? Like, were you like the main reviewer in that case, or were there several people reviewing everything?
I was the main reviewer. There were a few review comments by other people, but I don't think anyone else tried to do the sort of comprehensive review that I did. They just mentioned one or two things that they noticed.
Okay. When doing a review of kind of that magnitude, is your strategy to kind of, tackle each thing at once, but be asking questions as you go, or do you kind of take notes and then go back to the committer once you've really seen the full picture?
I do it a bit at a time, because the review itself could be overwhelming. If I saved it all up and made one comment, it would be hundreds of lines long. Many of my comments would include 10 or more sections, each one with a code snippet and saying, well, I think you should change this, and why should you do that? A lot of my comments are questions rather than things that I think should be changed. And I think that's good for as documentation, right? The public review process, which is one of these weird things about open source that no one else has. It's a form of documentation, and people should talk about why they're doing things and ask and answer questions as part of that process.
So what is the next phase for this? What are there any more additional changes coming?
There certainly are. So the main thing is something that almost made it into Drupal 9.3. I was so excited when the issue was fixed before 9.3 Alpha 1 came out. And I said, great, it's going to be in 9.3. And then it was in the beta release. There were, I think, 3 RC releases of 9.3. It was in all of those. And then 2 days before 9.3 was released, it was torn out. But it's still there in 9.4, so we are going to see it. And there's a follow-up issue. But what it's going to do is add a permissions tab for For example, for the article content type. So for the article content type, you have a tab to manage fields, manage display, manage form display. If you have translation enabled, you have a tab to translate it. And starting with 9.4, you'll have a tab to manage the permissions for the article content type, the 8 or 9 permissions that I mentioned earlier. That would be amazing.
Yeah. And
it's something that I've looked at, I think, since I started working with Drupal in Drupal 5 or 6, that, okay, there are these so many permissions per content type, and then I've got all these content types. Surely somebody has a page with just the permissions for the article content type. Oh yeah, layout builder, that's another one. Once you enable layout builder, if you allow overrides for article nodes of the layout, then there's a permission for that too. So that brings us up to 10, I think. And the great thing about that is that it is possible because of the issues we've already talked about, right? The issue that gets rid of phantom permissions, I mentioned, it's possible because now Drupal keeps track of permission dependencies. And so in particular, Drupal keeps track of which permissions depend on the article content type. And then the issue that creates the permissions page for each module and that bit of restructuring I talked about, that's what makes it possible, or at least that's what makes it easy to create the page with just the permissions that depend on the article content type.
That's great.
Okay.
So this is sort of the natural culmination of those two. And the reason it was taken out is that initially we sort of did it by default. So if you have an entity type, and it's not just articles, and it's not just nodes, it's also vocabularies, and if blocks have permissions, if block types have permissions associated with them, you'll get a page for that.
Or media types as well?
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah, I think in fact the issue originally started out of a discussion of media. And it was a discussion we were talking about before. Should we add permissions for each media type? And oh no, if we do that, it's going to make the permissions page that much worse. And that's where this discussion got started, really. So initially, we made it by default. If you have any entity type that meets this or that criteria, we will create a page for you. And unfortunately, that was a bad idea and caused problems specifically with the group module, which has its own permissions tab already, and didn't want our permissions badge, certainly didn't want our permissions tab at the same URL. So now there's an RTDC issue to make it an opt-in, that it doesn't get added automatically. That the person, the module that creates the entity type gets to decide whether or not it will add the permissions tab. So that's coming soon.
Before we go on to the next question, I did have one quick question.
Yeah.
These dependencies, I imagine, only get calculated on import, export, and when you're going to these pages, like these particular pages you're talking about, right? They're not loaded each time permissions are checked, right?
Certainly not each time permissions are checked, but every time you save a user role, it calculates dependencies.
Okay. Yeah. So there's not going to be any performance implication visiting pages or things like that. It's only when you're dealing with actual permissions that this will have any sort of impact, I imagine.
Yeah. The only thing that might be a performance issue is when you go to the page that lists all of your vocabularies, or the page that lists all of your content types. Okay. It's checking access for a bunch of pages. And as part of checking access, it uses the access control system to say, well, if there aren't any permissions associated to this content type, then I won't allow access to it. just because that's technically easier than not having the page at all. So,
Okay.
so potentially there's a performance issue there. I haven't noticed a problem.
But that's on the admin side.
Yeah.
Okay.
And who cares about them? Right, Nick?
I certainly care about them, but you need to
Yeah.
prioritize
Okay. It's true.
end users.
So as we bring the show to a close here, I'm wondering, you have this experience, you have many years in the Drupal community. If folks wanted to help with permissions or another Drupal core issue, both code and non-code contribution wise, what would you point them towards? How would you tell them to get started?
Yeah, so a couple of suggestions. One is to start attending one of the weekly meetings. There are several. They're on the Drupal core calendar. I've mentioned the usability meeting and the migration meeting that I go to every week. There are a bunch of other ones. There are different times of day, so they cater to people in different time zones. Start going to one of those and participate, talk to people, get some ideas of what needs to be done. And there is a lot that needs to be done. If you're willing to put in the work, are a lot of non-code things that need to be done, like for a meeting, someone has to take notes and post the record, and someone has to make sure that people who attended the meeting get credit for it. And then if it's a Zoom meeting, it's a lot like this podcast. Someone has to edit the videos. Thank you, Nick, for doing that. I do that every week for the usability meeting, which is in Zoom. Issues need to be, I don't like the word triaged, but they need to be updated in various ways. So often people are sort of afraid to touch the issue description, but it's so important to update the issue description as the direction of the issue changes, so that someone new coming to look at it, including the core committer who's going to do the final review, can tell from the issue description what changes are being made and why.
Mm-hmm.
So updating issue descriptions, putting in screenshots, making sure that the issue status is appropriate, that if there's a patch, it's not still listed as active. If the patch has failed, make sure that it's in the need work phase. So there are a lot of things that need to be done. Oh, and at the last DrupalCon North America, or DrupalCon Global, I guess, there were several initiatives announced, and the hardest thing to find for each initiative was not the developers willing to work on it, but the project managers willing to work on it. So there's a ton of stuff that needs to be done there. And then one more suggestion is that there are probably hundreds of Slack channels in Drupal Slack. So go hang out in a Slack channel that interests you. There's a migration channel and a UX channel that I hang out in, because those are things I care about. But that's a really great place to meet people, find out what people are working on, ask for help, offer to help.
Shameless plug. There's a Talking Drupal channel too, but
there is. I joined it recently.
There you go.
So Benji, permissions aside, what other Drupal related projects or puzzles are you excited to tackle in the new year?
So there are a bunch of things that I'd like to do with the Migrate API if I could find the time, and I don't know that 2022 will be the year I get to any of these. But I'd like to have better JSON parsing. There's an issue for the Migrate Plus module that would improve that. I'd love to have a source plugin customized for the JSON API. So any Drupal site now has the JSON API module since Drupal 8.4, I think, maybe 8.3. So we can export all of our Drupal entities to JSON API, which is not just JSON. It's JSON of a particular structure. It has standards for pagination. And so I'd like to do the reverse with Migrate API, that if someone gives me something in the JSON API standard, that it's really easy for me to import it into a Drupal site. I'd like to make the UI better for the Migrate API. And as one of the maintainers, it's sort of my responsibility to keep the issue queue under control. And luckily, I'm not the only one responsible for that, because it is a huge job. And then there are tons of ideas that come up at usability meetings. So a couple of things we've talked about recently are the appearance page, the one that lists all the themes, and we have some ideas for making improvements there. And another is the user edit form. Like, it's really confusing if you want to change, if you're an administrator and you want to assign a role, content author role to a user, that you have these password fields showing up that you really only need if you're changing the email address or the password. And like, maybe we should have a separate form for doing that and get them off the one where you're assigning roles. And then just every week something different comes up, and a lot of those are things that I would like to be able to follow up on.
Do you want to do all the things?
Unfortunately, yes. And you know, as I work in Drupal, as I'm now one of the core subsystem maintainers, that's the official title, since I'm one of the maintainers in Migrate API, I sort of get beyond thinking about what can I code myself to how can I encourage other people to do the coding and do the review, and sort of unblock them from making the contributions.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of goes back to the core sustainability, right? You know, one of the value add, like if there's something particularly deep, then in an issue, you might need somebody that's one of the core subsystem maintainers to do the coding. But sometimes the value is just the knowledge of the whole system. So you can tell somebody who's looking at a particular issue, like, yes, you can make this change here. It's not going to break anything.
Right.
Here's how you write the test. You know, here's a good example of a test that does something similar to what you're doing. Copy that test and then modify it. Because, you know, if you're, you know, even if you're a somewhat experienced developer trying to make a change to like something as integral as the Migrate API, it can be really intimidating. And having somebody with that institutional knowledge to be like, hey, here's where you need to look, that can really, you know, aside from boosting confidence, they can really open some doors and make it a lot easier for them too. And if you have multiple, you know, if you have one person helping out several people that way, then that can really, but yeah, having that can really unblock a lot of things. Whereas you can only work on a couple of issues at a time where you're the one actually producing the work product. Well, Benji, thank you for joining us. It's always a pleasure having you on. And I want to personally thank you for all the contributions that you've made over the years, but in particular, the permissions ones. Like I said, it's one of those systems that people sometimes take for granted, but it is one of the huge benefits of using a system like Drupal. And, you know, I feel like every year or two, it's only every year or two that we get improvements to the permission system, but it feels like in the next, you know, 6 months or so, we're getting improvements incrementally, which is always great. Because I feel like the last innovation for permissions was kind of getting the FPA system into core for Drupal 8, right? So that you could filter the permissions page. But even some of these basic changes, like having a page per module, like that's one of those things that's so, or like per content type, that's one of those things that's so obvious and so useful. But you know, you just kind of learn to live with the pain of the permissions overview page. And having somebody come in and improve that is a huge benefit for the community. So thank you for that. You
learn to live with the poisonous bullfrog. If we did show titles, that would be it.
But he's getting less poisonous. He's getting cuter and friendlier.
That's dangerous.
Yes.
Do you have feedback or questions Reach out to Talking Drupal on Twitter with the handle Talking Drupal or via email at show@talkingdrupal.com. You can connect with our hosts and other listeners on Drupal Slack in the Talking Drupal channel. If you're interested in show news, upcoming Drupal camps, local meetups, and Chad's Book Corner, sign up for our newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
You can promote your Drupal community event on Talking Drupal. Learn more at talkingdrupal.com/camp promo.
Thank you, patrons, for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and choosing the big button in the sidebar, Become a Patron.
And Benji, if our listeners wanted to get in touch with you, what would be the best way to do that?
So I'm Benji Fisher on Drupal Slack. You can Google me. You can find me on LinkedIn. On Twitter, I was kind of slow to join the bandwagon, so I couldn't get Benji Fisher. So I inserted my favorite number. I am Benji17 Fisher on Twitter.
And Abby, if our listeners want to get in touch with you?
Yes. So best way to reach me is Drupal Slack at ABOWMAN.
And how about you, John?
I'm John Picozzi, and you can find me on all the major social networks and Drupal.org at John Picozzi, and you can find out about EPAM at epam.com.
And you can find me pretty much everywhere at NixVan, NICXVAN.
And if you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking. Thanks, everyone.
See you guys next week.